Now, turning to our program, please welcome Daniel Golden, the owner of Boswell Books and this year's Rotary Person of the Year, who will introduce our speaker.
First of all, I really love that comment about asking questions. So I might ask for those notes and start saying it. It's a really good idea. Second of all, I don't have as good a talk as last time, so it's very short because I'm just introducing today's wonderful speaker. I do want to say it's day 5262, and also mention one event coming up because we work so much with the library, and Joan is one of the members here. There's an event with Meg Kissinger for the launch of While You Were Out, an intimate family portrait of mental illness. She's in conversation with Jackie Leiden. It is next Tuesday. It's a registration. It's at the Centennial Hall. You can go, but you don't have to go because she'll probably speak here as well. So you can just wait. But all that pales in comparison to today's event. We are so honored to be selling books for and a part of the visit of David Maranniss for Path Shaped by Lightning. One of the things that is really wonderful about working at the bookstore is what great readers the booksellers are and how excited they can be for books coming out. And I have a bookseller named Tim McCarthy who just writes these very passionate reviews, and he loved this book so much that I can only read a tiny little portion of a very long review. But I will just say the extraordinary details of Jim Thorpe's life, including his many connections to Wisconsin and Milwaukee, are endlessly fascinating, and Maraniss makes them exceptionally smooth reading. He wraps Thorpe's life into the story of America. He's blunt about our cruel contradictions in such an intelligent way that my progressive anger feels completely validated. This is a top-flight history lesson that separates the truth from the myth of a legendary and iconic American. So I could not do that. So write that well. So Ernest is a New York Times bestselling author, fellow of the Society of American Historians, and visiting distinguished professor at Vanderbilt University. He has been affiliated with the Washington Post for more than 40 years as an editor and writer, twice won Pulitzer Prizes at the newspaper. Plus, They Marched into Sunlight was a Pulitzer finalist. He has won many other major writing awards, including the George Polk Award, the Robert Kennedy Book Prize, and the Anthony Lucas Book Prize. He lives in Washington, D.C., and lucky for us, also summers in Madison. So please give him a warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for your bookstore and all independent bookstores in the country, which are my home courts, I consider them. I'm always happy to come to Milwaukee. It's one of my many sort of adopted hometowns. My parents, after I grew up in Madison, but my father was the editor of the Capital Times in Madison, and right after he retired, they moved to Milwaukee. And he said it's because he didn't want to wake up every morning and re-edit the newspaper that he no longer was the editor of. So this doesn't quite make sense, but then he took a job with Mayor Meyer, which seemed like enough of a interesting choice in and of itself. So they lived here for many years. My mother worked at the Literary Center here, helping people learn how to read. And my wife Linda was here, and I would visit often. Plus, I'm a huge Milwaukee Brewers and Bucks fan and Packers fan. And even my son, who we left Wisconsin when he was 4 years old, is probably the biggest Brewers fan ever. And one time he went to visit my parents, his grandparents, by himself. And my dad was working, so he was with my mother for a week. And she said, well, what do you want to do today? And he said, go to a Brewers game. Next day, what do you want to do today? Go to a Brewers game. So they went to every Brewers game for the whole week. That's my son. So this is my 13th book. And it came to me in an interesting way, it was more than 20 years ago that I was on a book tour for They Marched into Sunlight, another of my books. I was in Denver, and after my presentation, a gentleman came up to me and introduced himself as Norbert Hill, a member of the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin. And he handed me a sheaf of papers and said, "David, here is your next book." And I looked at it, and it was some material on Jim Thorpe. And I very politely said, "Thank you, Norbert. I'm honored that you would think this. I never take advice from anyone else. I'm working on another book, and it has to come organically from me for me to be obsessed with it, to spend 3 or 4 years on the book." And that was that. And little did I realize that he planted a seed, but he did. And it took about 20 years to grow and turned into this book. And I had written 2 other books about sports figures who transcended sports. As a matter of fact, my first time coming to speak to the Milwaukee Rotary was, I can't believe it, but 24 years ago, when I spoke about When Pride Still Mattered, my biography of Vince Lombardi. That was my first sports book. The second was Roberto Clemente. And in both of those cases, what I was looking for was a way to illuminate American history and sociology through the drama of sports. So for Lombardi, it was not just, of course, I grew up here, so I was a huge Packer fan during the glory years, but that's not why I wrote the book. I wasn't going to write a book about Bart Starr or Brett Favre or Aaron Rodgers or anyone else. It was Lombardi because of what he represented, which was not only a story of leadership, but also a way to explore the mythology of competition and success in American life, what it takes and what it costs. That's why I wrote that book. For Clemente, it was not just a beautiful ball player. As a matter of fact, growing up in Wisconsin, my heroes were the Milwaukee Braves. You know, Henry Aaron, Warren Spahn, Lou Burdett, Billy Bruton, all those guys. About 12 years ago, I was invited to Milwaukee to speak at Henry Aaron's annual fundraiser about Clemente. And I said at that event, you know, Mr. Aaron, you're my hero growing up, but I also loved Roberto Clemente. And as a matter of fact, the Milwaukee Braves had a chance to sign Clemente before the Dodgers originally did. And I said, and if they had, you would have been playing left field. And he laughed and said, "You're right." Anyway, I wrote about Clemente not because of his the fact that he was a great ball player, but because it was a chance for me to explore some other issues, the rise of Latinos in American life. And so many sports figures are called heroes, and very few really are. Clemente was. His motto in life was, if you have a chance to help others and fail to do so, you're wasting your time on this earth. And he lived and died that motto, dying in a plane crash trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Nicaragua after an earthquake in 1972. So those are the motives for writing that. And I was thinking, well, this maybe is a trilogy. And the third book in the trilogy will be Jim Thorpe, who not only was arguably the greatest athlete in American history. After this book came out, I did 3 debates on Zoom and in person with a fellow writer, Jeff Pearlman, who wrote a biography of Bo Jackson. And the question was, who was the greatest athlete, all-around athlete ever? And I creamed him all 3 times, according to the vote. Or Thorpe did. I didn't do it. But no one did what Jim Thorpe did. The triad of not only being an All-American football player at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the first great professional football player, the first president of what would become the National Football League, but also a brilliant all-around track star who won gold medals in the decathlon and pentathlon in Stockholm in 1912, and a Major League Baseball player. No one had done all 3 of those things before or since. Not only that, he was also a great skater, a hockey player, a swimmer, a champion ballroom dancer, and even good at marbles. So there was nothing that Jim Thorpe couldn't do. But that's not why I wrote the book. Again, I wanted to use the drama of that athletic life to illuminate the Native American experience through his life. Jim Thorpe was born in Indian Territory of what became Oklahoma in 1887. He was from the Sac and Fox Nation. The Sac and Fox also have a deep connection to Wisconsin. As a matter of fact, through Black Hawk, his mother would tell young Jim Thorpe that he was the reincarnation of Black Hawk. And in many ways, he tried to live that out through his life. He was born in a year and died in a year that bracketed the way that the United States government abused the Native peoples. 1887, the year he was born, was the year of the passage of the Dawes Act, which essentially took away millions of acres of native lands and tried to turn the Indian people into private landowners, taking away their communal property. Part of the effort of what you see throughout his life of forced assimilation of native peoples. That was 1887. It led a few years later to the noted Oklahoma land runs, which went into the territory that the Sac and Fox and Potawatomi and Cherokee and other Oklahoma tribes had. That was taking away most of what became Oklahoma from the Indian people. And he died in 1953, a year when Congress passed a Termination Act to try to eliminate the government recognition of tribes. Just last week in Madison, I attended the funeral of Ada Deer. Some of you might remember her. And she really led the effort of the Menominee people to restore a restoration of their tribal rights, and succeeded in that. And that happened only after Congress tried to take everything away from them. So those bracketed Jim Thorpe's life. And in the middle of it are the Indian boarding schools. When he was 7 years old, he and his twin brother, Charlie, most people don't know he had a twin, because Charlie died when they were 9 years old when a disease swept through the Indian boarding school in Stroud, Oklahoma, the Sac and Fox School. That was the first place that Jim went. Then he kept trying to run away from that school. His father sent him then to the Haskell Institute up in Kansas. He ran away from there too, as did so many young Native students. And his father said, well, I'm going to send you so far away you can't run back home, and sent him to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. And that's where he rose to fame. Unbelievably to me, he arrived there when he was 16 years old, and according to the logs that I found of his entrance, he stood 5'5" and weighed 115 pounds. 3 years later, he was the image that you would see on the cover of the book. So he had an incredible growth spurt. But it wasn't until those 3 years later that he got into sports, basically. And the story of how that happened sounds mythological. And there are, believe me, many, many myths about Jim Thorpe. It's almost like Paul Bunyan in some ways. One myth that he would tell himself was that one time when he was playing baseball, he hit home runs into 3 separate states. He was playing in Texarkana, Arkansas, and hit home runs into Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. That's the story. But of course, it's utterly impossible because Oklahoma is 23 miles away. That's just one of many, many myths about that either people told about Thorpe or he told about himself. But the myth of his sort of sports origins is 1907. He's working on the farm at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School and walks by the athletic field in his flannel shirt and work boots and sees some track guys trying to clear the high jump bar at 6 feet, and they're failing. And Jim Thorpe, in those boots and work clothes, easily clears the bar. The next day, he was on the track team. And before the year was out, he was on the football team and the star of both, an All-American football player. And in that era, the great football teams were not Ohio State, Alabama, Oklahoma, LSU, but Penn and Harvard and Army and Yale. And the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, this little school comprised of Native Americans, would beat them all. They were the greatest team in the East Coast for all of those years that Jim Thorpe was there. Probably the most iconic sporting event, or there are two that are in my book that I love. The first one I call the greatest act of sports retribution in American history. This was 1912, and Carlisle Indian Industrial School was playing the Army. It was the Indians against the Army on a level playing field at last. And the Indians knew what this meant. You know, most football games don't have any larger meaning. This one did. One of the players on the Army team was a sophomore linebacker and running back named Dwight David Eisenhower. Before the game, Eisenhower had conspired with one of his teammates to try to knock the great Jim Thorpe out of the game by hitting him high and low at the same time. Football has always been a brutal, violent sport, but it was even more so in that era when there were less concerns and rules about the dangers of it. So in the third quarter, they finally were able to tackle him high and low at the same time. He was on the ground groggy, but after a minute, he got up. And a few minutes later, he knocked Eisenhower out of the game. And that was the end of that. That same year, 1912, so I call that game the greatest game of athletic retribution in American history. Jim Thorpe's year, 1912, I consider the greatest single year of any athlete in American history, because it was also that year that he went to Stockholm and won those great gold medals in the decathlon and pentathlon and became the most famous athlete in the world. Also, so it was the high for Jim Thorpe and then the low, because only a few months later, a story appeared in the Worcester Telegram in Massachusetts, quoting a manager of a Bush League baseball team in North Carolina, saying that Jim Thorpe played for him for 2 summers for the Rocky Mountain Railroaders and Fayetteville Highlanders in the Eastern Carolina League, which meant that he'd been paid, that he was a professional, and so therefore, within a week, his medals were taken away from him, all of his records were stripped. It was the most unjust act in American sporting history, and I document the 4 reasons why. The first is that, yes, he was playing minor league baseball in the Eastern Carolina League for those 2 summers, as were scores, if not hundreds, of college athletes. Most of them were playing under aliases. That same future President Eisenhower played in the Kansas State League under the name Wilson. It was common practice. There were so many aliases in the Eastern Carolina League that its nickname was the Pocahontas League because everybody was named John Smith. Jim Thorpe played under the name Jim Thorpe. He never tried to hide it. His name was in the papers in Carolina, in Charlotte, and Raleigh, and Rocky Mount for both of those summers. But it was only until it broke on the east, in the Northeast, that it became this big story. The second reason it was unjust is because of the utter hypocrisy of the powers that be who turned him in. The first was Pop Warner, his coach at Carlisle. Some of you might know about the Pop Warner Youth Football Leagues. Well, that's the same Pop Warner. He went on to coach at Pitt and Stanford and elsewhere, but he really made his name coaching the Indian athletes at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Warner knew exactly what Jim Thorpe had been doing. He'd been sending Indian athletes to play baseball in the summer for years before that. One of his best friends in Pennsylvania, another coach up there, actually scouted Thorpe and 2 other Carlisle Indians to go play in the Eastern Carolina League. Yet when the story broke, Pop Warner pretended he knew nothing about it, claimed his innocence to save his own reputation, as did James E. Sullivan. Some of you might have heard of the Sullivan Award, which is given to the greatest amateur athlete every year. Well, James E. Sullivan then was the head of the Amateur Athletic Union and of the American Olympic Committee. He was also on the board of advisors for the Carlisle Indian Industrial School Athletic Department. He also knew exactly what Jim Thorpe was doing and yet lied about it. And they're the two who made the decision to send his trophies and back and strike his records. The third reason is the whole question of what's an amateur, who's an amateur and who's a professional. The whole notion of amateurism was basically a concept foisted upon the athletic world by plutocrats and aristocrats in Europe who talked about the purity of sports because they didn't need any money. They were already rich. But most athletes come out of the working class and need the money. In any case, for those 1912 Olympics, Jim Thorpe played baseball, had nothing to do with the track and field events that he excelled at and won the gold medals for. In those same Olympics was another future American general, George S. Patton, who competed in Stockholm in what was called the modern pentathlon, which were all military-style events. Patton had been being paid by the Army for a few years to train in equestrian and fencing and rifle shooting that were the events for that event. Was he a professional or was he an amateur? The entire Swedish national team was given a leave of absence for 6 months before the Olympics started with pay to train for the Olympics. Were they professionals or amateurs versus Jim Thorpe? So there was the utter hypocrisy of that question as well. And finally, there was a technical reason, which is that the Olympic rules of that era said that any challenge to someone's amateurism had to come within 30 days of the end of the Olympics. This story broke, the records were sent back 6 months later. So even technically, if not morally and hypocritically, it was unjust. And yet it took 110 years for Jim Thorpe to have his records and trophies restored. It was only last year, finally, that it fully happened. I said that the 1912 Army Indian game was one of my two favorite iconic moments in the book. The other happened in Milwaukee. And it was a professional football game involving the Oorang Indians and the Milwaukee Badgers in 1922. And the Oorang Indians, Jim Thorpe was the player coach. This was actually an NFL team comprised entirely of Native Americans. Jim was a little bit over the hill, as were two of his buddies. The rest of the squad was taken from different tribes around the Midwest. It wasn't really a very good football team, but they were in the NFL. And the Milwaukee Badgers were led by Fritz Pollard, the first great African-American professional football player before the color line barred black players for more than a decade after that. But the star of that team was Paul Robeson. Yeah, the great lawyer, singer, actor, and activist. And I just, when I was writing the book, I was thinking, God, I would have loved to have been at that field that day to see the African-American Colossus, Paul Robeson, play against the Native American Colossus, Jim Thorpe. The Milwaukee Badgers won, and Paul Robeson scored both touchdowns in the game. But that was another fabulous moment of Jim Thorpe's life, which runs through virtually every famous person in American life in the first half of the 20th century. He ended that first half of the 20th century being voted the greatest athlete of that period, more so than Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, Jack Dempsey, any other athlete. It was Jim Thorpe. He died 3 years later in 1953 of a heart attack in a trailer park in Lomita, California. It was a very difficult afterlife for Jim. What I call the afterlife is for athletes all those years after their fame. Um, unlike most people, they've reached their peak in their early 30s, and then they live out the rest of their life. For Jim, it was a struggle. He lived in 20 different states, including coming back to Milwaukee briefly to live here for a little while. Um, he had jobs ranging from being a greeter at bars to being the head of youth athletics at the Chicago Parks Department, to acting in Hollywood. He was in more than 70 movies. You can barely find him in most of those movies, even if they say featuring Jim Thorpe. He was famous, but Hollywood was mistreating Native Americans like every place else was. As a matter of fact, most of the westerns of that era had white guys dressed in war paint playing Indians. And Jim Thorpe, who was an activist for that brief period of his life, sort of led about 200 Native peoples who were out in the Los Angeles area fighting against the studios to say, hire us for those jobs. And also, with a few exceptions, John Ford being one, most of the directors were advancing the typical stereotypes of Native Americans, which Jim Thorpe, by the way, had to deal with his entire life. Whenever the press would write about him, even sympathetically, he was always called chief. He wasn't a chief. He was always on the warpath and taking scalps. That's just the way that the press dealt with him. But his life was difficult after his athletic career. He had 3 wives, 7 children who didn't see him that much because he was always on the move. He struggled with alcoholism and then died almost penniless in that trailer park. And as I was writing the last 10 chapters of the book, I knew how it was going to end, but I kept thinking something better's got to happen. Something has to happen, and it doesn't. And so then I started to think about, well, what is the essence of this story? Is it tragedy or not? Because there were elements of tragedy to it. But I decided it wasn't. And in 1915, when Jim was at the height of his athletic prowess, the most famous sculpture in America was called The End of the Trail. It depicted an Indian slumped on horseback. The horse drooped as well. And the notion was it was all over. Manifest destiny had prevailed. This race was dying and would soon die. There were only about 300,000 Native Americans left in this country at that point. But it didn't happen. And for all of the troubles that Native peoples have had to endure over the many, many decades since then, they survived. The effort at the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, the motto there when Jim was there was, kill the Indian, save the man. Meaning we're not going to literally kill you anymore, but we're going to force assimilation onto you, turn you into white people so that you survive. That was basically the government policy for all of that period. And that didn't totally succeed either. Many of those Carlisle students figured out how to survive, and many of them became lawyers and doctors and really helped advance the Native causes over the many decades since then. And the Native population now is up over 2 million, where it was really in danger at that point. The cultures are coming back. They're starting to emphasize the Native culture and even languages again. So that the end of the trail didn't happen. And it didn't really happen for Jim Thorpe either. For all of the troubles that he endured, some of them self-inflicted, many of them by society, he just kept going. And so I decided that this story wasn't a tragedy, wasn't a lesson of tragedy, but one of perseverance. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions. I guess you're supposed to, well, I don't know how it works.
And as a reminder, please keep your questions concise, but you may ask a question using this microphone here.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. And I'm hoping you can tell us something about what is forthcoming from your pen.
Well, I have a racket going at the Washington Post where they let me do what I want for the rest of my life. But this last 4 months, I've been working on a fairly large profile of Jim Jordan, the congressman, who actually went to the University of Wisconsin, was an All-American wrestler there. But as for books, I haven't signed the contract yet, but I have an agreement with Simon & Schuster. I thought I was writing a trilogy of sports figures who transcend sports. It turns out it's going to be a quartet. My next book is about Jack Johnson, the great boxer who overcame a lot, was sort of the Muhammad Ali before Muhammad Ali, and the government went after him. And it's just a very rich story of race in America in the early 20th century. So that's it.
David, you talked about your dad at Cap Times and Good American Family. Tell us a little bit about how your dad and what he stood for and how he did his work influenced the selection of your topics, but also how you pursued the storyline.
Yeah, my dad grew up in Brooklyn, was at the University of Michigan in the late 1930s, was involved in leftist politics there, and was eventually hounded in the McCarthy era, the Red Scare. That's how we ended up in Madison, because the Capital Times hired my father when other papers would not, and really saved my family, saved my dad and my family. And that's one reason why I feel I owe so much to that city and that newspaper, and have tried to pay it back ever since. But my father, I mean, you can start just by saying in World War II, he was the commander of an all-black army unit. And he inculcated in his children and everybody he dealt with the notions of racial equality and of rooting for underdogs. And I would say that has definitely affected almost every book that I've written in some one way or another. Even Lombardi. He was great on issues of race and gender. He had a gay brother, and you think of Lombardi as the ultimate macho man. He told his other coaches and his team, if I hear any of you picking on a couple of the players that were known to be gay, you're gone. That was Lombardi. When he first got to Green Bay, he went to all the taverns. Well, nobody could go to all the taverns in Green Bay. He went to many of the most popular ones and said, if I hear you discriminating against any of my black players, you're off limits for the entire team. So Lombardi was terrific on those issues, and that was one of the reasons I was attracted to writing about him. But so generally, in answer to your question, I'm not going to just write about anybody. I want it to have a larger social meaning, and that really came out of my dad.
I've been remembering how much I enjoyed when Pride mattered. So
Thank you.
I'll try the book on Jim Thorpe. It may be outside the scope of your book, but I'm curious about the Carlisle Indian School. Did you learn much about that school? Its history before,
yes,
after Jim Thorpe?
Thanks for asking.
Schools like that in the country?
Yeah, it's not outside my book. My book, the center of the book is the Carlisle Indian School. I just compressed my normal speech today for time reasons. But as I said, the motto of the school was "Kill the Indian, save the man." It was founded in 1879 by a military officer, Richard Henry Pratt, who had been involved in the Indian Wars. And he thought he was doing good, that we're no longer going to just try to kill them, but we'll try to save them by turning them into white people. Carlisle was the flagship Indian boarding school for the U.S. government. There were many other boarding schools around the country, including in Wisconsin and throughout the Midwest and the Southwest and the South. But this was the big one. This is where students from all over the country were sent to Carlisle, sometimes against their will. The first students who went there in 1879 were the sons and daughters of Lakota Sioux, whose parents had fought against Custer. The notion was we're going to tame the next generation. And many of those students thought they were going east to Carlisle to show their bravery and to die. And tragically, many of them did die. The most haunting, what was the Carlisle Indian boarding school is now the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle. Many of the buildings are still there. And also still there is the Indian Student Cemetery. Row after row of young students from every tribe you can imagine who died while they were at Carlisle, still there. And only in the last 10 years are some of the bones of some of those young people being repatriated to their homelands, including the Oneida in Wisconsin, who came out and got a few of their people back. So the boarding school started in 1879. It was at its peak of fame when Jim Thorpe was there, 1907 to 1912. And then shortly after that came World War I, and the military wanted that. It had been a military base going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. The military wanted it back to use it as an Army war hospital for troops coming back from Europe. And so, and also in that period right after Thorpe was there, it became apparent that the school was a sham and a scam and not doing the students any services. And so there was a congressional investigation at which it was revealed that Pop Warner, the famed Pop Warner, was illegally paying the players, was abusing the Indian students, as were the superintendent and other faculty members there. And so the congressional investigation slowly led to the closing of the school in 1918 when it became reverted to its military use.
Curious with the travel that Jim Thorpe had. We know what the black athletes had and the discrimination and having to stay in separate hotels and that. So we're talking earlier with Jim Thorpe. How was he for the travel and for the Indians at that time? Did they run into the same sort of things?
You know, thanks for asking that question because it's really a fascinating difference between the way African Americans and Native Americans were treated by the dominant white society. Native Americans were romanticized and diminished at the same time. They were segregated against in many ways, but not in the same ways. So that Jim Thorpe, in the heat of Jim Crow America, could go down to Jackson, Mississippi and speak to the Touchdown Club there, you know, in a place where the only African Americans there were the waiters. So, you know, he was able to play professional baseball at a time when no black players were allowed to play. So there were those differences. There was other forms of discrimination, but not as overt as against African Americans. He was never, there were certain places where the Native peoples would sit in a certain section, like black fans would have to at baseball games and so on. But generally speaking, he could go just about anywhere. It was just a matter of condescension more than outright discrimination.
Today's athletes have endorsements and get virtually unlimited amounts of equipment, from shoes, tennis rackets, skis, or what have you.
Yeah.
Tell us about Jim Thorpe's equipment.
Jim Thorpe's equipment. There wasn't much. When he was playing football, most of the guys didn't even wear helmets. Some of the opponents claimed that he put little steel blades in his shoulder pads. He didn't. He was just tough and had sharp shoulders. Nobody wanted to tackle the guy. The football equipment was incredibly, there were no thigh pads, very minimal shoulder pads, if any. Some wore helmets, some didn't. Everything was different. The football was a different shape. It was more like a rugby ball, which is why in that era, Jim Thorpe, by the way, was not only a great running back and defensive player, but also a brilliant kicker. He could punt for the Packers today. He would routinely punt at 70, 80 yards. But he also was a drop kicker, which was easier when the ball wasn't as shaped as sharply as it is today. But everything about the equipment was different. And when you talk about athletes today, if Jim Thorpe played today, he wouldn't have had many. He might have had other problems, but not the same ones. He would be a multi-millionaire. The most he ever made was less than $7,000 a year playing football. He never had much money, and what money he had, he would give away. He didn't have any endorsement powers, or any of that stuff. So it was completely different in equipment and every other way for Jim Thorpe.
Thanks for your comments about the book. Sounds very intriguing. One of the best books I've read in a long time was your former book, A Good American Family.
Well, thank you.
I would recommend that to anybody. But that brings up the kind of a side topic. What is your opinion of the state of American journalism? You touch a little bit on him, and
that's not a side topic, man. That's my life. There is so much to say about that on every possible level. I mean, you start on the local level, and the dissolution of local newspapers has led to the crumbling of American democracy, in my opinion. I don't think anything is more important than covering the local democracy, and that's happening less and less. There are few people covering state houses and city councils and county boards and all of that. And then you've got the tendency towards people just blabbing without doing the reporting. I have nothing against opinion. I think a debate is an essential part of democracy. But somebody has to go out there and actually find out what's really going on. And there are fewer actual reporters doing that, both at the local level and at the national level. I work at the Washington Post. I consider myself lucky because it doesn't have most of those problems. It has a vast and talented staff, and we're doing our best to keep up with everything. But social media has changed so much. And the internet, I mean, it's a force for evil and for good, and we haven't figured it out which is going to prevail yet. I mean, as a historian, the web is invaluable for me. There are now literally millions of primary documents that I can find online, which would have taken me months to comb for before. Although I still love to go to archives and find the real paper. But there's also so much disinformation to deal with. And then we've got the coming of artificial intelligence, and who knows where that's going to take us. But that's going to affect newspapers and news and everything else in ways magnifying what's already happening with social media because of that. So, I've been an optimist my whole life. I inherited that from my father too. But I don't know where these things are going, and I'm worried about it.